The depth of the skin is an unimaginable paradox. The distance from the surface to its opposite side is minutely fathomless. The skin is both surface and organ, boundary and bridge. It is simultaneously the site of the sense of touch and the seamless enclosure that separates self from other. Everything happens at the surface. The needle pierces its outer protective layer, the epidermis, perforates a lattice of nerve endings, and passes through the connective tissue of the vascular dermis. Its penetration is a kind of sleight of hand, the act itself doubling back on the meaning of the word, to pierce, to permeate, to infiltrate, and to understand. The needle performs a logical and a topological inversion, making a hole and closing it, opening a continuous surface to its other and its opposite. The familiar distinction between outside and inside dissolves, like the reflection that absorbs first Alice's hand and then her whole body as she passes through the looking glass. On the other side, an inverted terrain, a moment of misrecognition. You catch a glimpse of your reflection in a mirror and imagine that you are seeing through to another space, encountering someone uncannily familiar, yet entirely other. You feel a sense of autonomy, perhaps power, but this dissipates in a moment of recognition, disappointment, and self-betrayal. The needle eases into the vein at a 45-degree angle. The plunger retracts and blood backs up into the barrel of the syringe. The reciprocal exchange of fluids threatens contamination on both sides of the skin. What belongs inside seeps out, while the alien, the foreign substance, the parasite, passes through, violating the autonomy of the biological organism and the social order. The reversal is sickening, vertiginous. This moment of penetration, flooded with fascination and revulsion, turns back and over, like a Mobius strip, a band that is severed, twisted, and the ends sewn back together the wrong way, creating a continuity of outside and inside. The image of a needle perforating the skin, always unnerving and repugnant, is, when self-administered, also obscene, which is the original meaning of both illness and disease, obscenities wrought on the self. In a culture that refuses weakness and fears vulnerability, where the idea of transmission is synonymous with terror, the hypodermic needle, the break in the skin, the release of blood, offend and frighten as much as the specter of illness, pain, and dependence do. Those who inject their own palliative, like heroin addicts and diabetics, are stigmatized as much by their association with the needle as by their dependence on a drug. Junkies will joke that they are more addicted to the needle than to the dope, the prick of memory, and the anticipation of pleasure. Hand, needle, and vein transform each other. With each injection, the needle makes a new opening, and for a time, turns the old surface under. Who doesn't long for renewal, regeneration, and return? Who doesn't feel the impulse to reverse time, the urge to reproduce the skin, the blood, the self? It's the surge of biology, the imperative of survival, the craving for more than one more day. Every morning of my childhood, I heard the click of my father's wedding band against the glass as he rolled a vial of insulin between his hands before drawing up a syringe. He didn't explain. He never let me watch. His hand first held the needle at the age of 11. He practiced by sticking a syringe into an orange over and over again until he got up the nerve to push the needle into his own skin. He injected himself twice a day for 66 years. He was a type 1, juvenile onset, brittle diabetic. My father's pancreas did not produce insulin, or at least not on a regular basis. Insulin is the hormone that controls the level of blood glucose or sugar, the chemical the body produces to feed the brain. Any fluctuation in the supply of blood glucose to the brain will inevitably lead to physical and emotional disorder. To Too little blood glucose and the brain starves. Too much and the resultant chemical changes can lead to diabetic ketoacidosis and possibly fatal coma. Like all type 1 diabetics, my father was dependent for life on exogenous insulin, which can only be administered through subcutaneous injection. The trick to survival is not to inject too much, which can lead to insulin shock, or too little, which can lead to diabetic coma. It's a delicate balancing act on a biochemical seesaw. As I grew up, I watched my father ride that seesaw. I observed the schizophrenic abnormality of his everyday life without having any knowledge of the cause. If he came home from work even half an hour late, he would already be in ketoacidosis. The symptoms, stumbling, slurring, and giggling, looked like the drunkenness acted out in television sitcoms. At the opposite and more frightening extreme, when his pancreas kicked in and the combination of exogenous and endogenous insulin spiked way beyond normal levels, his body would be possessed by violent jerking and seizing. When I found him like this, in shock, attempting to shout, barely able to choke out an utterance between spasms of pain and humiliation, he would force me to leave the room. He never explained. We didn't speak about it. He was a quiet man who otherwise never raised his voice in anger. But I know he didn't want me to see his loss of control, his inability to govern his own body. In the accepted regimen of treatment for diabetes, it is the patient's responsibility to manage his own condition, to self-medicate, to adhere to a rigid diet and schedule, to manage to stay alive. My father never rebelled against the discipline required by his condition, but despite his willpower and his nerve, he was brittle. He was never able to perform the balancing act, to bring that bad, sweet blood under control.
Up until the age of 18, I had never been a chump before. When I turned 18 years old, I met a guy who became my first son.